The letter from the Admiralty arrived on a morning when the frost was so thick on the window that Rosamond could not see the sea. And she knew before she broke the seal that it would bring no comfort. She had been awake since before first light. The fires in the Renham house required careful management in December. The coal was measured out by the scuttle now, not by the bucket. And the kitchen hearth alone was kept burning through the night. Rosamond had risen in the grey dark to stoke it herself, as she had for the past 2 winters, because the girl who used to do it had not been replaced when she left for a position in Exeter. There was no point in replacing her. The economies of Wrenwood Cottage had long since passed the stage of polite concealment and arrived at something quieter and more absolute: the careful management of what remained. The morning came in slowly over the cliff top. Through the frosted pane, the sea was nothing but a pale suggestion, a smear of white light where the horizon should have been, and the smell of salt came through the gap beneath the casement, even in winter, as it always had. Rosamond stood at the kitchen table in her heaviest shawl and read the letter by the light of a single tallow candle, because the beeswax ones were kept for evenings when Captain Renham sat up late with his maps. The Admiralty's reply was 2 paragraphs. The first expressed, in the clipped language of government clerks, their appreciation of Captain Renham's 31 years of service to the Crown. The second cited, with equal brevity, the present economies, and informed him that his petition for an increased allowance could not, at this time, be approved. There was a signature at the bottom that Rosamond did not recognise, and did not trouble to decipher. She read both paragraphs twice. Then she folded the letter along its original creases, as though it were something that could still be kept, and held it a moment in her hands. Her father was still asleep. She could hear the slow creak of the floorboards above her, the particular shifting of old timbers that meant he had turned in his sleep and not yet woken. He had been sleeping later this winter, which the apothecary, a mild-mannered man named Mr. Forrow, attributed to the cold working against his injured knee, and which Rosamond attributed to something else entirely: the slow diminishment of a man who had once commanded 300 sailors on a frigate, and now commanded only his own careful stillness. She carried the letter to the kitchen fire. She did not read it again. She held it at the corner, let the flame catch the bottom edge, and watched the paper blacken and curl. The Admiralty's seal went last. A circle of dark red wax that softened, buckled, and then was gone entirely. And when the last corner had disappeared, she used the poker to press the ash down into the coals. By the time her father came downstairs for his breakfast, the grate was clean, and there was nothing to find. This was not deception, or not exactly. It was management. Rosamond had been managing the gap between what Captain Renham knew and what was true for long enough that the practice had lost its sharpest edge. She kept the household accounts in a small brown ledger she kept locked in the top drawer of her writing desk. She had sold her mother's garnet earrings 18 months ago at a jeweller's in Lyme and told her father the garnets had simply been lost. She ordered the coal and the flour, and settled the accounts at the chandler's and the grocer's, and she knew, to the penny, how many months remained before the choices became ones she could no longer make quietly. The Admiralty's letter had made that number smaller. She set the kettle on the hob and began to slice the bread. She was on the lane by 9:30, her basket on her arm, the cold off the fields pressing at her cheeks, when Mrs. Pettifer stepped out from behind her own gate, with the particular timing of a woman who had been watching from her front window and judged the moment precisely. Martha Pettifer was a widow of 8 years' standing, the relict of a solicitor who had left her a comfortable house and the considerable habit of interest in her neighbours' affairs. She was not a malicious woman, or not consciously so, but she had discovered, as some women do after long widowhood, that information was a form of company, and that the gathering of it gave each morning a purpose nothing else quite managed to replicate. She wore, even in December, a bright, cherry-coloured pelisse that she believed made her appear spirited. It made her appear, in Rosamond's private view, like a robin that had moulted its sense of proportion. "Miss Renham!" Mrs. Pettifer fell into step beside her with the ease of long practice. "You are early." "I am always early, Mrs. Pettifer." "I imagine you must be." A pause, perfectly calibrated. "I heard from Mrs. Cobb at the draper's that there was a letter from London yesterday. From the Admiralty, she believed." Rosamond did not slow her pace. The lane was stiff with frost underfoot, each dead leaf edged in white. "Mrs. Cobb keeps a busy ear for a woman who sells muslin." She meant no harm. "We are all of us concerned for the captain, naturally. It has been some time since his petition was acknowledged. One begins to wonder whether London remembers these things, what with all the talk of present economies." Another pause, lighter, more pointed. "Or perhaps the matter has been settled. I should hate to think of your father troubled." The lane curved past the stone wall that separated the Pettifer garden from the open field beyond, and for a moment the sea came into view between two frost-white cottages. A strip of dark grey water, very cold and perfectly still. Rosamond looked at it briefly, the way one looks at something that cannot be changed. "My father is in excellent health," she said. "Thank you for your concern." Of course, of course." Mrs. Pettifer slowed at the lane's corner, her territory ending there as surely as if it had been marked on a map. "One only asks because one cares. It would be such a shame, with the captain's record of service, if the proper recognition were delayed further." Rosamond turned to face her. Not with anger. Anger was a luxury she could not afford in a village this small, where even the most minor exchange was remembered and repeated for weeks. But with the particular steadiness of a woman who has learned to hear every possible version of a sentence before it is spoken. "He is very well looked after," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Pettifer." She walked on. Behind her, she felt the older woman's gaze follow her to the bend where the lane dipped toward the village, and she did not look back. Ahead, the church tower emerged from the mist at the top of the hill, its weather vane a fish above the greyness, motionless in the still December air. The morning passed in its ordinary round. The grocer on the high street, a careful man named Penrose, who had extended their account through 2 seasons without ever quite mentioning the figure aloud, served her with the practiced cordiality of someone who has resolved not to make things worse. She bought what was needed and no more. A twist of black tea, a small piece of hard cheese, a quantity of dried lentils. On the walk home she passed the churchyard, its yew tree dripping frost melt onto the graves of men who had also once expected more from the world than they received, and she thought about Tom. Thomas Renham was 22 and alive somewhere in the Atlantic, working the Lisbon trade on a merchant vessel whose captain had a reputation for being merely careless rather than genuinely dangerous. He wrote when he could, which was seldom, and his letters when they came were cheerful and thin. Cheerful in the way of young men who have no notion what their families might actually need to hear. The captain's great ambition these 3 years had been to purchase Tom a better berth, a first officer's position on a reputable vessel, somewhere north of the line. It required money. Everything required money, and yet the household continued, the fires were lit, the bread was sliced, the brass was polished, and Rosamond did not permit herself to stand still long enough to arrive at the precise sum of what was owed and when. It was better to keep moving. She came home to find her father in his usual chair by the parlour fire, his bad knee extended on the footstool, a chart of the Hebrides spread across his lap that he had been studying, off and on, since Tuesday. Captain James Renham was 63, broad-shouldered in the way of men who were once considerably broader, with white hair that he kept cut short out of a lifelong preference for order. His face, when he looked up at her, carried the expression he reserved for her arrivals, a relief he never named, covered immediately by a show of studied ease. "Any news from the village?" "Mrs. Cobb has a new bolt of French muslin she's very pleased about," Rosamond said, taking off her bonnet and hanging it on the peg in the hall. "Mrs. Pettifer is in excellent health." The captain made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. He had known Martha Pettifer for 14 years and had a very accurate assessment of her character, though he was too courteous to render it aloud to his daughter. He returned his attention to the Hebrides. Rosamond went to the kitchen and began the preparations for dinner, and for a while the only sounds in Wrenwood Cottage were the creak of the fire, the distant soft voice of the sea, and the rhythmic, practiced movement of a woman who had learned to make enough out of very little, and had learned it so thoroughly that the effort was no longer visible from the outside. The carriage arrived in the afternoon, when the winter light had already thinned to that particular shade of coastal gold that lasted perhaps an hour before it turned grey and closed. Rosamond had moved her chair to the sitting-room window for the last of the brightness. She could read without a candle for perhaps 20 more minutes, if she tilted the page correctly, when she heard the wheels on the lane. It was not a modest carriage. The horses were very good. A matched pair of dark bays with the deep chest of animals that had been properly schooled and properly kept. And the coachman's livery was dark blue with brass buttons, each one catching what remained of the afternoon. Rosamond set down her book and watched the carriage slow before the gate of Wrenwood Cottage, with the measured attention of a woman who has learned not to form conclusions before she has the full picture. Her father stirred in the parlour. She heard the familiar effort of him rising from his chair, the particular sequence of sounds that told her, without her needing to look, exactly how the knee was faring. And then his voice, low and wondering. Good God. She had not known what this was. She understood, later, that Captain Renham had been half expecting it, or something like it, because a letter had reached him the previous week from an old shipmate, one Captain Alderton, who had served with him on the Heron 30 years before, and who had mentioned in passing that the Duke of Eastmoor had been making quiet inquiries about the captain's present circumstances. Captain Renham had said nothing to Rosamond about this letter. He had, in all likelihood, not wished to raise hopes he could not guarantee. So she came to the front door, not knowing nothing of Alderton's letter, nothing of the inquiries, nothing of the letter that had reached the Duke himself, and that had brought him now, in the thin December afternoon, up the path to their gate. She opened the door to find a man already through it, taller than the title had led her to imagine, and younger, with dark hair and a grey coat of charcoal wool, cut by someone who understood the difference between formality and display. He carried his hat in his hand rather than on his head, which was the gesture of a man who had decided, before arriving, to arrive without ceremony. "Miss Renham." His voice was measured, quiet, with the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being heard in large rooms and choosing, at this moment, not to fill one. "Forgive the intrusion. I served briefly with your father aboard the Formidable in '96. I wished to pay my respects." Behind her, the captain's voice, warm and surprised, and carrying the sudden lift of a man who has not had enough reason for warmth lately. "Eastmoor! By God, man, come in!" The Duke of Eastmoor stepped across the threshold, and as he passed her, Rosamond watched, because she watched everything, always. It was the habit of a woman who could not afford to miss things. As his gaze moved, briefly and carefully, to the curtains of the sitting-room. They had been turned and re-hemmed so many times that the original fabric survived only in the deep centre folds, where no light reached. The movement of his eyes lasted perhaps a second. He said nothing, and his expression gave nothing away, and Rosamond would not have caught it at all had she been any less practiced at looking. She stepped back to let him pass into the parlour, where her father was already pulling out the better chair and using the voice he reserved for men he had genuinely been pleased to see. She stood a moment longer in the doorway before closing it against the cold, the late light falling across the garden, the frost beginning already to return to the gravel path, the lane behind the gate perfectly empty and still. He had looked at the curtains, and whatever reason had brought him here, courtesy, memory, the obligations of an old acquaintance, she understood, with a certainty she could not yet account for, that he had not come only to grieve a shared past. What he had seen in this house, and what he meant to do with what he had seen, those were questions the afternoon had not yet answered. The tea that Rosamond served was not from the good caddy. That had been empty since October, its interior still carrying the faint ghost of better leaves, and she had not yet replaced it because the account at Penrose's was already a longer conversation than she wished to have. What she poured now was the morning's purchase, a black tea, strong and a little rough at the edge, in the 2 least chipped cups she owned. She set the tray on the low table between the men, and withdrew to the window seat with the unremarkable efficiency of a woman who has long since stopped performing composure and simply inhabits it. Captain Renham and the Duke of Eastmoor had arrived, within 5 minutes of the fire, at the easy grammar of men who shared a particular kind of past. Naval conversation moved fast and sideways. Place names, ship names, dates that meant something only to those who had been present. Brief references to men who were dead, and briefer ones to men who were merely elsewhere. The Duke spoke of the formidable without effort, which told Rosamond he was not performing the memory. He named a midshipman's mistake in a squall off Finisterre that made her father laugh for the first time in 3 weeks. A real laugh, low and sudden, the laugh of a man surprised by a genuine recollection. She kept her eyes on her book and did not turn a page for 10 minutes. The parlour, she knew, showed well enough by afternoon light. She had positioned the chairs to face the fire rather than the window, which kept the worst of the faded wallpaper in shadow, and the brass on the mantelpiece was polished to a severity that passed for intent rather than poverty. The rug was thin at the centre, but she had moved the hearth rug over it, and the effect, in this particular angle of December light, was of a room merely understated rather than depleted. Whether the Duke was fooled, she could not say. She suspected he was not. It was the captain who reached for the snuff-box. He did it absently, the way one reaches for an object that has stood on the same surface for years, without ceremony, without announcement, the way familiar things are handled. He kept it on the far end of the mantelpiece, beside the small barometer he checked every morning, and the miniature of Rosamond's mother painted in the year of their marriage, when Susan Renham had still had her colour. The box was silver, tarnished now to the warm grey of old pewter, and small enough to rest entirely in the palm. He turned it in his fingers as he spoke. "We lost 12 men in that storm," the captain said. 9 at once when the foremast came down. The other 3 took 2 days longer about it, which was almost worse. He set the box on his knee and looked at the fire. Holt was one of the 9. The Duke had been following the story with the attention of a man who had heard its kind before without becoming impervious to it. But at the mention of the name, something altered in his face. Small, controlled, a brief stillness in the line of his jaw. "Lieutenant Holt," he said. "You knew him?" "I knew his family." The Duke's voice was even. "His younger brother served under me in the Baltic 4 years later. I wrote the family when we lost the brother. I did not know about the lieutenant." The captain turned the box in his hands and held it out across the low table. "He gave it to me as we carried him below. He knew, I think. He was very calm about the whole business." The faintest pause. "I've kept it since." The Duke took the box and turned it, and Rosamond saw the precise moment he found the crest. A small thing engraved on the underside of the lid, worn with years of handling, but still readable to eyes that had reason to look for it. The Holt crest, a chevron between three hunting horns. The device she would not have recognised herself. The Duke recognised it without question. He held the box a moment longer than was necessary before returning it, and then he looked at his hands. "Captain," he said, after a pause that was not uncomfortable but was not small. "I hope you will permit me to say something plainly, because I have not enough remaining patience for the alternative." He met the captain's eyes with the directness Rosamond had already observed was characteristic of him. "Alderton wrote to me, some weeks ago, before I came. He mentioned, not in detail, but sufficiently, that things had grown difficult here. I did not come only on his account, but I came knowing something of the situation, and I would feel dishonest pretending otherwise." The captain received this with no visible alteration of his expression, which told Rosamond he had known of Alderton's letter and had been waiting for this. He had not told her. She understood why. The same instinct that had led her to burn the Admiralty's reply rather than let him read it. And she felt, briefly, the strange mirror of it. Two people in the same house, each quietly managing the other's exposure to difficulty, neither one entirely succeeding. "You are generous," the captain said. There was no bitterness in it, and no false modesty. "But there is nothing to be done about it that I would permit to be done." "Your son's passage?" "No." The captain said it warmly, with the ease of a man delivering a verdict he has long since prepared. "I am grateful for the thought. I know what it costs to make the offer. But I have not asked for it, and I will not take it. And I hope we may remain on the same footing nonetheless." The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then, "I respect that entirely." And he did. Rosamond heard it. The absence of the particular note that enters a man's voice when he is merely respecting something in order to look well. He set down his cup and remained in his chair, and they spoke for another half-hour about the Baltic and the Hebrides and the quality of the winter. And by the time his carriage was called, the captain's voice had settled into the register she associated with his best evenings. Not happy, exactly, but inhabited, fully present in a way the Admiralty letter had unmade that morning. She stood at the door to see the Duke out, and said nothing that required an answer, and he said nothing that required one from her. He put on his hat at the gate, and she watched the carriage pull away down the frosted lane until the dark bays disappeared around the bend. And then she went inside and stood for a moment in the hall with her hand on the door. The vicarage of St. Anne's sat at the far end of the churchyard, shielded from the lane by a broad yew and by 30 years of ecclesiastical neglect in the matter of its gutters, which had stained the stonework to a pleasant dark streak that the vicar, Mr. Hathaway, considered an improvement. He was a man of 70 with the particular vigour of those who have decided that age is primarily an administrative problem, and he had served this parish since the year of the American difficulty, long enough to have buried 3 generations of most families in it. He knew Captain Renham as well as a vicar knows a man who attends church faithfully but keeps his private griefs to himself, which was to say, he knew the shape of things without being in possession of the particulars. The Duke came to him 4 days after the visit to Wrenwood Cottage on a morning of hard grey sky, and Mr. Hathaway received him in the study, a room of spectacular disorder, every surface occupied by sermon notes, commentaries on Pauline letters, a broken microscope inherited from a previous vicar, and 3 decades of parish records bound in cracked calfskin. He poured the Duke a glass of cold elderflower cordial without asking whether he wanted it, because Mr. Hathaway's hospitality was sincere rather than consultative. "You are wondering whether to continue your visits," the vicar said, before the Duke had fully arranged his question. "Something like that." "You are concerned it will appear as condescension, or else that it will become attachment." Mr. Hathaway regarded him over the rim of his own glass with the equanimity of a man who has heard most of the available varieties of human complication and developed, over time, a fondness for the subject. I can tell you that the captain is not a man who receives either condescension or attachment without speaking his mind about it, which means he will inform you clearly if either has occurred. And his daughter? The vicar set down his glass beside a commentary on the Epistle to the Romans and was quiet for a moment. Outside, a sparrow alighted on the study windowsill and regarded the room with brief professional interest before departing. Miss Renham, Mr. Hathaway said, has been managing that household since she was 19. She sold the last of the servants' wages from her own quarterly dress allowance for 2 years before anyone noticed. And no one noticed only because she did not wish them to. She is not a woman who asks for things. She is also not a woman who mistakes a gesture for its motive. He looked at the Duke directly. So the question is what your motive actually is. If you can answer that clearly, she will not mistake it. The Duke was quiet for long enough that the silence was informative. Then continue your visits, the vicar said, with that clarity when you arrive at it. The Duke left an hour later, and Mr. Hathaway stood in the cold doorway of the vicarage, watching the carriage go, and then returned to his Romans commentary, which had been waiting patiently and deserved better than it had been getting. It was Rosamond who raised the subject of the snuff box. She had not intended to. It arose from the particular arithmetic of a sleepless Tuesday, when she had been through the brown ledger twice and arrived at the same number, which was not large enough. Her father was at the parlour fire. He had the box in his hands again, which he had taken to doing this week more than usual, and when she came in with the evening lamp, he looked up with the expression that preceded the thing he was about to say. Marchant would give a fair price, he said, for the box. He had a buyer for silver last month, a collector from London. No. It is only a thing, Rosamond. It isn't only a thing. She set the lamp on the table and sat. The firelight caught the box's tarnished surface and made it warm, the worn crest invisible at this angle. You have carried it for 30 years. It is not a thing you pawn for 1 month's coal. We will find another way. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his face that she did not name, a grief that was not about the box exactly, and not about the coal, but about the whole long fact of their situation, which had required his daughter to make decisions of this kind for long enough that she made them without visible effort. He set the box back on the mantelpiece without further argument. The subject was closed, and they did not return to it. What she did not know, and would not know until later, was that the Duke had returned to Wrenwood Cottage 2 mornings later on a pretext of returning a naval chart he said the captain had lent him on his first visit, which was a fiction of such mild transparency that her father had accepted it with the same good grace he brought to all fictions offered kindly. What Rosamond did know was that he had come and gone while she was at the market, and that when she returned the captain had a particular quality of ease about him, the ease of a resolution recently made. She asked no questions. The snuff box was still on the mantelpiece. She assumed it had remained there. It had not remained there, as she would discover, though for now the box sat exactly where she expected, and she had no reason yet to look at it closely enough to see that the tarnish on the lid had been gently disturbed, as a thing is disturbed when it has been picked up and examined by a second pair of hands. The week settled into its ordinary shapes. The frost held through Thursday. Tom's name did not appear in any letter, which meant only that the post from Lisbon was running slow. Mrs. Pettifer, encountered again at the draper's, offered no commentary on the Admiralty, whether because she had not heard further, or because she had heard something that gave her reason to rethink her position, Rosamond could not say. The Duke's next call came on the following Monday, and this time she was in the house. The Monday visit was different from the first in one essential respect. This time, when he came through the door and her father received him in the parlour, Rosamond did not withdraw. She was not sure, afterward, what had stopped her. The habit of the house was for her to make herself useful at the margins of her father's conversations with men of position, not invisible, but peripheral, present enough to manage the tea and absent enough not to require acknowledgement. She had long since made her peace with this arrangement, or had made something that functioned as peace. But that Monday she remained in the parlour chair with her mending in her lap, and neither man seemed to find it unremarkable enough to mention. The Duke had brought a small parcel. He set it on the side table with the particular deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed the gesture and decided the most honest way to make it is to make it plainly, without ornamentation. "I told you, when I came before, that I had known the Holt family." He addressed this to the captain, but he did not quite look only at the captain. The elder son, the lieutenant's brother, was a young man of considerable promise. He died in the Baltic in the winter of '8. He was 24. A brief pause. "His family are all gone now. I have no one to return this to, and I should be sorry to see it leave this house when it was given here in good faith." The parcel contained the snuff box. It was wrapped in a piece of cloth that was itself a considered thing. Not a servant's cloth, not a paper parcel, but a square of dark wool flannel, folded with the precision of a man who had wrapped it himself. The captain looked at it for a moment in his hands, and then at the Duke. "The Holt family. All gone," the Duke said again, quietly. "It belongs where it was given." He met the captain's eyes, and something passed between the two men that Rosamond read as the recognition of a shared principle. The objects carried by the dying belong to those who carried the dying, and that restoring them is an act of record-keeping, not charity. The captain set the box back on the mantelpiece, in its accustomed place. Rosamond watched it take its position again, beside the barometer and the miniature of her mother. And she understood, without being able entirely to name what she understood, that the gesture had been made, not for the captain's sake, but for hers. The Duke, when he left that afternoon, paused in the hall while she handed him his hat. "Miss Renham." He said her name as though it were a statement of fact he wished to be precise about. "I believe you are perhaps the most competent person in this household, and I suspect you have been for some years. I say this because I believe you deserve to have it said plainly, not because I imagine it requires confirmation." Rosamond held his hat a moment before handing it over. "That is a very unusual thing to say to a woman you have met twice." "I know it is." He took the hat without deflection. "I hope it was not unkind." "It wasn't unkind," she said. "It was simply very accurate." He left, and she stood in the hall in the January cold and thought that she had not had a conversation like that one. Direct, without the usual social furniture arranged between the speakers, in a considerable time. Possibly ever. The invitation to Sir William March's dinner arrived 3 weeks later, addressed to Captain Renham and his daughter, which was unusual enough in itself. Sir William March was a baronet of the older sort, good family, moderate estate, the kind of man whose social calendar represented, for much of the county, the outer boundary of acceptable ambition. His wife, Lady March, was a sociable woman of 45, who collected interesting dinner guests the way a careful naturalist collects specimens, with genuine enthusiasm and considerable taxonomic certainty about where each one belonged. Rosamond appeared on the evening of the dinner in her grey dress, the good one, with the small worked collar she had added herself from a remnant of her mother's things. And her father wore his naval coat with the braid he still kept in proper order, because old habits of maintenance die hard in men who were once responsible for a ship's appearance before an admiral. The March house was warm and bright, and smelled of hothouse flowers that had been brought in from somewhere distant at considerable expense. And the entrance hall contained, besides the requisite mirrors and the porter, 2 gentlemen she did not know, and 4 women who recognised each other very well, and had made, before Rosamond's arrival, their preliminary assessments. The dinner itself was managed with the courtesy that is almost indistinguishable from the deliberate withdrawal of real welcome. She was placed at the lower end of the table, beside a young clergyman of no particular opinions, who addressed most of his conversation to the dish before him, and across from the wife of a wool merchant, who spoke exclusively to the woman on her left. The conversation at the table's upper end, where the captain sat between Sir William and a retired colonel, was lively enough to reach her as a continuous murmur without any particular content. Rosamond ate and watched, and did not perform the injury of it. The Duke was not present at the March dinner, which she had been told to expect. A prior engagement in the counties east, or some such arrangement, and yet his name came up twice in the drawing-room afterward, in the way that prominent men's names circulate in rooms they have vacated, with a mixture of reference and speculation that tells the careful listener exactly who in the room has thought about him most. Both times his name was raised by the younger of the 2 women she had not been introduced to, a dark-haired woman of about 30 in a gown of amber silk, who wore her composure like a garment she'd had made to measure. Lady Marchcourt, she heard someone murmur. She filed the name. On the drive home, the captain sat in the corner of the hired chaise, with his injured knee extended across the seat and his eyes on the passing dark of the lane, and said nothing about the dinner, except that Sir William March kept a very decent cellar. Rosamond agreed that he did. They drove the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of 2 people who understand the same things about an evening, and have no need to say them aloud. Eastmoor Park announced itself through its gates before it showed its house. The gates were ironwork, older than the current Duke's tenure by at least 2 generations, and the ironwork carried a design of intertwined oak leaves and anchors that spoke of a family which had once been naval and had become landed without fully deciding which it preferred. Rosamond had seen the park only from the road before, its trees standing back from the lane at the proprietary distance of old money. Coming through the gates for the first time, in the first week of February, she felt the scale of the place rearrange her sense of proportion, the way entering a cathedral does. Not by intimidating, exactly, but by requiring a brief adjustment. The captain had been invited to tour the estate's library, which contained, the Duke had mentioned in passing, several volumes of naval chart work and hydrographic survey from the 1780s that he thought might interest a man of the captain's background. This was very possibly true, and very possibly also a reason invented after the decision to invite them had already been made. Rosamond came with her father because there was no one at Wrenwood Cottage to come with him instead, and because she had found, in the 6 weeks since his first visit, that being present when the Duke was in the room was preferable to being elsewhere. She met Mrs. Haddon in the hall. The housekeeper was a tall, gaunt woman of perhaps 60, with the particular posture of someone who has been in charge of a large house for long enough that the house has begun to take on the qualities of her personality. Ordered, slightly austere, resistant to alteration. She wore black, as housekeepers do, but hers was the black of genuine preference rather than convention. Her face, when she received Rosamond, was a very controlled piece of work. No hostility expressed. Everything managed below the surface. A quality of watchfulness in her eyes that took in Rosamond's grey dress, and her plain bonnet, and her father's naval coat, and rendered, in the space of 3 seconds, a verdict it would have taken her several weeks to unsay. Miss Renham, the name delivered as though it were a footnote in a document that would not change any conclusions. His Grace is in the library. I will have tea brought. The house was cold, in the way of large houses in February. Not the cold of poverty, which penetrates, but the cold of volume, which merely persists. Someone had lit the fires in the principal rooms, but the corridors between them retained the patience of stone that has been cold for months. Rosamond followed Mrs. Haddon's precise, unhurried progress through a series of rooms that she catalogued without meaning to. A morning room with curtains of heavy green damask, a card room with a set of lacquered chairs grouped around a table of unusual design, a passage hung with portraits that had the expressions of people who had all been formally instructed not to smile. The library ran the full length of the East Wing's ground floor. It was a good room, not showpiece good, not the library of a man who has bought books to fill walls, but the library of a family that has been reading in it for 100 years and has left the evidence. The volumes were worn, some of them, with the selective wear of genuine use. Spines broken at favourite passages, margins thick with generations of annotation. A whole shelf of naval matters that was clearly organised by someone who knew how to read a chart. The captain went directly to it with the instinct of a man coming home to something he had not expected to find, and the Duke received him there with a quiet pleasure that Rosamond recognised as the pleasure of watching someone inhabit a room as it was intended to be inhabited. Mrs. Haddon withdrew. A housemaid, a girl of perhaps 16, named Polly, who had the wide eyes of a household servant still recently enough employed to find everything notable, brought the tea and arranged it carefully on the low table near the fire, and in performing this small service, positioned herself to catch 2 seconds of observation of Miss Renham before departing. Rosamond did not acknowledge this directly, but she noted it. The domestic intelligence of a house begins with its youngest members. She moved to the window while the men settled into their charts. The parkland in February was stripped down to its bones, long grass pale at the edges of the formal lawns, the ornamental lake a flat grey plate under the sky, the oak trees at the park's edge standing in the solid, patient way of trees that have been standing in that same position for longer than the current family. She thought the park was more beautiful like this than it had probably been in summer, with all its structure visible and nothing soft yet to obscure it. When she turned back into the room, she was alone. The captain and the Duke had moved, without her noticing, to the far end of the library, where the hydrographic volumes were shelved, and their voices came back to her as a low, steady conversation of technical enthusiasm. Coordinates, soundings, the particular characteristics of a northern channel. She was alone in the nearer half of the room, with the fire and the tea tray and the wide desk that stood at an angle between the 2 tall windows. The desk was a substantial piece, oak, darkened with age, with a leather writing surface the colour of old port, and a set of small drawers along the right side, each fitted with a brass pull. She was not inspecting it. She had simply come to stand nearer the fire, and the desk was between her and the hearth, and she looked at it the way one looks at any object of character in a room, with a mild, uninvested attention. One of the small drawers had a keyhole. The others did not. She stood and looked at this small fact for a moment. The lock was not new. The brass around it carried the dull softness of something handled repeatedly over years. And the keyhole was of the kind fitted to a drawer one returns to, not one sealed shut permanently. She looked at it without touching it, and she understood, with the quiet certainty of a woman practiced at reading the arrangements of rooms, that this drawer contained something the Duke had needed to keep separate from everything else in the house. Personal, not private in the legal sense. The papers of grief rather than the papers of administration. His brother. She had heard the name Henry in a single mention, from Alderton's letter, the captain had said, or perhaps from something the Duke had said in passing about the Baltic. She could not now quite reconstruct exactly where she had first heard it, but she knew. There had been a brother named Henry, and the brother was dead, and the weight of that death was present in this room, in the quality of the Duke's silence when he first entered it each time, and the particular relationship he had with the space just here, near these windows, near this desk. She moved away from the desk and returned to her chair near the fire. She did not hear him come across the library. The carpet was deep enough to absorb footsteps entirely, and when he spoke, she did not startle, because some part of her had registered the change in the room before his voice arrived. "The view is better from this end," he said, "but the fire is better from yours." He came and stood near the desk, not between her and it, simply near it, his hand resting on the corner in a way that was unconscious enough to be truthful. "My father sat here every morning," he said. "My brother used to sit on the floor beside it when they went over accounts together." Henry found the whole process of estate management unconvincing, and expressed this by declining to use a chair. Rosamond looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the desk, with the expression of a man who has come, through long practice, to live with a memory in a room without being undone by it. "How old was he?" she asked. 26, when he died. The Duke moved to the second chair, the one on the far side of the fire from hers, and sat, not in the manner of someone performing ease, but in the manner of someone who has decided the conversation should continue. Fever in the summer of 12. 4 days from healthy to gone. A pause. He had written me a letter the week before he fell ill. A perfectly ordinary letter, full of commentary on the harvest and a joke about our steward's boots. I have read it perhaps 200 times. There is nothing in it that could have told me. There is nothing in any of it that could have told me. But the mind returns to it looking for the sign it wasn't there to give. Rosamond held her cup and said nothing. "I have not told anyone that," he said. Not in the tone of a man surprised to have spoken, in the tone of a man who has registered, carefully, that this is the first time. The fire moved between them. From the far end of the library came the low, steady voices of the captain and his charts. 200 seems about right, Rosamond said eventually. For something you cannot change. He looked at her then, directly, with the same quality of attention she had noticed from the first. The attention of a man who means what he looks at. She returned it without adjustment. What he would do with the things he had begun, in the space of 6 weeks, to find in her, that was a question the afternoon had opened, but not resolved. Outside, the February sky pressed down on the stripped park, and the oak trees stood in their old patience. And somewhere in the east wing, Mrs. Haddon moved through the house with her purposeful, defensive step, keeping order over everything that could be kept. March arrived without apology. Cold still, but with the particular quality of cold that has begun to negotiate its terms. The mornings smelling of turned earth under the frost, rather than frost alone. Rosamond noticed the change on the lane one Tuesday, the way the light came in at a different angle through the bare hedge, and thought that in 6 weeks the season would have made its decision. She had developed, since the first visit to Eastmoor, a new habit of attention to the park's trees at the far edge of the lane, visible only as a dark line from the cottage gate. She did not examine this habit closely. Lord Frederick Vane arrived in the county in the 2nd week of March. He came from London, where he had been spending what his creditors and his temperament combined to make an instructive winter. And he came to Eastmoor not because the Duke had invited him, but because Lord Frederick had a talent for arriving in places he had not been invited and convincing himself in the process that the oversight had been inadvertent. He was 28, languid in the manner of men who have confused lassitude with sophistication, and he wore his dark hair brushed forward in a style that had been fashionable in London the previous season and was slightly too decided for the country. His connection to the Duke was through the Vane grandmother, second cousins, sufficiently removed that intimacy could not be assumed, but close enough that Lord Frederick assumed it freely. He also owed the Duke £400 from a transaction the previous autumn that neither man had formally named a debt, though both understood it to be one. Rosamond learned of his arrival the way she learned most things in that stretch of weeks, through the accumulated small channels of a village in which nothing remained private longer than the time required to repeat it. Mrs. Pettifer was one source. Another was Polly, the housemaid from Eastmoor, whom Rosamond encountered at the market on a Friday, and who offered, with the artless generosity of a girl who does not yet know what is significant, that his lordship had ridden out 3 times since his arrival, and had once come back smelling of wine before noon, and that Mrs. Haddon had expressed her views on this through the particular route of setting his dinner service with the smaller wine glasses. She filed this. She filed most things. The card party at which the rumour was introduced took place on a Thursday evening at the Grenshaws' house in the village. A comfortable, moderately ambitious household, whose evenings attracted exactly the mixture of the settled and the curious that made them useful for the circulation of information. Lord Frederick was present, which was in itself unusual enough to be noted. He played whist with moderate interest, and considerably more noise than the game required. And at some point in the second hour of play, at a table that included the wool merchant's wife, a retired naval surgeon named Fellows, and a solicitor's widow named Mrs. Trant, the remark was made. Mrs. Trant brought it to Rosamond the following morning, with the good faith urgency of a woman who genuinely believed that the person most likely to be damaged by information ought to receive it first. She was not Mrs. Pettifer. She was a quieter, kinder creature, whose instinct was to warn rather than to observe. She stood in the cottage doorway with her cloak still on and said it plainly, that Lord Frederick had told the table, in the casual tone of a man sharing something he expected to be already known, that the captain's illness last autumn had been exaggerated for the Duke's benefit, perhaps invented entirely, and that the Duke's visits to Wrenwood Cottage had their origin in a piece of calculated deception by a woman with no other prospects. Rosamond stood in the doorway and let the words settle. "Who else was at the table?" she asked. Mrs. Trant named them. Rosamond noted the solicitor's widow, who would tell the solicitor, and the naval surgeon Fellows, who would tell anyone who asked about naval matters with even passing interest, and the wool merchant's wife, who would tell everyone else. "Thank you," she said. "That was kind of you to come." She closed the door and stood in the hall a moment. The snuff-box was visible from where she stood, in its place on the parlour mantelpiece, and she looked at it briefly, the way one looks at something anchored. Then she took off her apron, put on her second-best bonnet, and told her father she was going out. The Marchcourt estate was 4 miles east along the coast road, sitting back from the cliff in the manner of a house that had been placed with care by someone who understood the sea's claim on attention and had decided to acknowledge rather than compete with it. Lady Marchcourt was a woman of 40, rich from a first marriage and formidably socialised from the 30 years that preceded it, and she had managed the county's social mathematics with the competence of someone who understood that influence is maintained less by what one holds than by what one can credibly threaten to withhold. Rosamond had not announced herself. She arrived on foot, which was itself a statement, and asked the gatekeeper to convey her name, and waited on the drive in the March wind with the straightness of someone who does not require comfort to hold their ground. She was shown to the garden, a formal parterre at the south side of the house, still mostly brown in early spring, the box hedges cut with geometric severity. Where Lady Marchcourt was walking, which told Rosamond the invitation to the garden, rather than the drawing room, had been a considered choice. Open air meant no witnesses who could be questioned afterward. Lady Marchcourt in person was handsomer than the amber silk at Sir William's dinner had led Rosamond to expect. A fine-boned woman, with the steady eyes of someone who has long since made her peace with being underestimated and decided to use it. She did not offer her hand. She turned when she heard Rosamond's step on the gravel, and regarded her with an expression of such composed neutrality that it announced, more clearly than hostility would have, that she had prepared for this meeting. "Miss Renham," she said, "you have walked 4 miles." "I have," Rosamond said. "I thought it better than writing." "Yes." A pause. Lady Marchcourt moved along the path between 2 box hedges, slowly, with the ease of a woman on her own ground, and Rosamond fell into step beside her without invitation, because there was no advantage in standing still. "I imagine you have come about the story your Lord Frederick has been spreading." "He is not my Lord Frederick," Rosamond said. "But yes." "He is an unreliable source," Lady Marchcourt said, with the bored certainty of someone making a factual observation. "He has been an unreliable source for the 3 years I have known him. That did not make him useless." She said this without embarrassment, which Rosamond respected more than she would have respected a denial. Lady Marchcourt had used Lord Frederick as a convenient conduit. She had just confirmed it with the ease of a woman who sees no point in performing innocence to an audience that will not be persuaded. They walked another 10 steps in silence. A crow alighted on the parterre's far wall and regarded the 2 women with the same calibrating attention they were directing at each other. "I did not invent my father's condition," Rosamond said. "The Duke came because he had heard of it from Alderton's letter and chose to come. I did not ask him, I did not engineer it, and I did not encourage it at the cost of anything the truth could bear." She kept her voice even. Not cold. Evenness is not coldness. Simply precise. "If your quarrel with this is about the truth, it cannot stand. And if it is about something else, I think you are owed the directness of having it named." Lady Marchcourt stopped walking. She turned and looked at Rosamond, with the full weight of an attention that had intimidated a great many people across a great many years. And what she found, apparently, was insufficient to sustain the usual mechanism. "What are you so afraid of losing?" Rosamond asked. The silence that followed was of a different quality than what had come before it. Lady Marchcourt looked away first. Not in defeat, exactly, but in the manner of a woman who has found, unexpectedly, that a sentence has stripped the conversational furniture from around her and left her standing in a space she had not intended to enter. She looked at the box hedge, and then at the house wall, and then somewhere into the middle distance of the cold March garden. And Rosamond watched, without pressing the advantage, because she had not come here for victory. She had come for the simple purpose of standing in front of a woman who had decided to damage her reputation and making that woman look at what she had decided to damage. "He will not make you a duchess," Lady Marchcourt said finally. "You understand that? The county will not accept it. His mother is in Bath," Rosamond said, "and I have not been asked anything." She left Lady Marchcourt in the garden and walked back down the parterre path without hurrying. At the gate, she turned and looked back once at the house, its pale stone flat under the March sky, and then turned her face into the wind off the cliff road and walked the 4 miles home. The Marchcourt ball was a fortnight later, on a Friday in late March, in a house that could accommodate 300 if the connecting rooms were opened, which they were. Rosamond wore the grey dress again. There was no other evening dress, and the grey had been carefully preserved for exactly this kind of necessity. And her evening gloves, which were white kid of a quality she had bought in the good years and had since mended at the right index finger with a stitch so fine it was invisible except under very direct light. She was aware of the men through the whole of the first hour, in the way one is aware of a thing only one can see. The Duke arrived late, which caused its own small ripple of attention, a quality of heightened positioning among the assembled guests, the way iron filings arranged themselves around a field. He had come with his estate agent, a compact, serious-faced man named Lowell, and without Lord Frederick, whose absence Rosamond noted as information. He moved through the opening set of rooms with the ease of a man who dislikes large social performances and has learned to manage them through the simple discipline of deciding, before he enters, what he means to do. Rosamond was talking to Mr. Hathaway, who had arrived in his second-best coat and his best good humour, when the Duke crossed to them. Mr. Hathaway greeted him with the warm ease of a man who has given someone counsel and observed it taken well. The Duke greeted them both, Mr. Hathaway by name, Rosamond by name, and then, by a look that held rather longer than the social occasion required, and in which she read, without difficulty, that he had heard about her walk to the Marchcourt estate, and had not yet decided whether to address it directly. "I owe you an apology," he said, when Mr. Hathaway had been collected by a passing warden of the parish, who required his opinion on a drainage matter. "You don't," she said. "Lord Frederick is your second cousin and not your responsibility." She held her champagne glass without drinking from it. "I dealt with it." He looked at her. "I know you did." A pause. "Mrs. Trant's husband is my solicitor's brother. Word travels." "Word always travels," she said. Around them, the ballroom had reached the pitch of a well-managed evening. The music from the quartet in the far alcove at the right volume to require leaning in to be heard. The candles in the chandeliers casting the particular warm light that makes everyone look as though they are lit by something kinder than reality. Lord Frederick was present after all. She spotted him near the card-room doorway, apparently having decided that absence would attract more commentary than presence. He caught her eye once across the room and looked away with the studied absence of expression of a man who has decided that blankness constitutes a position. The Duke moved once to the centre of the room. She noticed it before she understood what he was doing, a slight shift in his posture, the particular quality of stillness before a deliberate action. And then he spoke to Lowell, his agent, in a tone that was audible to the four people nearest them, but had the character of carrying further. "The quarterly settlement on Captain Renham of Wrenwood Cottage," he said, "was arranged last week. Tell Lowell to ensure the first payment reaches them before the month's end." Lowell confirmed it in his precise, professional way. The four nearest people registered it, with the graduated reactions of those who understand that they have just been given information intended to spread. Two of them glanced toward Rosamond, one toward Lord Frederick, one toward Lady Marchcourt, who was standing 20 feet away, and had heard the exchange with the absolute stillness of a woman who is processing the confirmation that a conversation in a cold garden has had its consequences. The Duke did not look at Lord Frederick. He did not look at Lady Marchcourt. He looked at Rosamond. She had not asked for the pension. She had not asked for any of it. Not the return of the snuff-box, not the vicar's counsel, not the visits, not any of the long accumulation of things that had been given without her requesting. What she understood now, standing in the Marchcourt ballroom in her grey dress with the mend on her glove, was that the Duke had understood this, had always understood it, and had worked to give what was needed without requiring her to perform the asking. He crossed the room to her. "Dance with me," he said, not imperiously, quietly, directly, in the manner she had come to recognise as his manner, the manner of a man who has decided to say the thing plainly rather than arrange furniture around it. She took his hand. What happened between the dance and everything that followed? What form the words eventually took? In what room and in what light? The ballroom's ending had not yet given that answer. It had given only this: his hand in hers, the music beginning, and the particular quality of the room rearranging its attention around a thing that everyone present could see, and only two people in it fully understood. The dance was a country dance, 3 couples, nothing that required more than the ordinary management of figures and turns, and it lasted perhaps 12 minutes. What it did in those 12 minutes was simple and irreversible. It placed them in the same conversation, in full view of 300 people, at a moment when the Duke's announcement about the pension was still moving around the room, the way a stone's ripple moves outward across water. Everyone present understood what was being observed. No one looked away. They did not speak much during the dance itself. The figures separated and returned them in their own rhythm. And what passed between them in the spaces when the music required proximity was managed by something that had, over the course of the winter, grown too particular and too specific to require the scaffolding of words. She was aware of his hand in the turns, the particular pressure of it, which was not proprietary, but was not impersonal either, which was something she did not have a word for in the available vocabulary of the season. She was aware that he was aware of everything she was aware of. Neither of them did anything with this, except move through the figures correctly. Afterward, he returned her to Mr. Hathaway, who received her back with the equanimity of a man who has already arrived at his conclusions and sees no reason to perform uncertainty. The Duke went to speak with Lowell. Lord Frederick had retreated, at some point during the dance, into the card room, with the purposeful air of a man relocating his dignity. Lady Marchcourt, Rosamond observed from across the room, was engaged in conversation with Sir William March's wife, a conversation of such concentrated normality that it could only have been deliberate. Mr. Hathaway handed her a fresh glass of champagne without commentary. "Thank you," she said. "It seemed required," he said. They stood in companionable silence for a moment and watched the next set form. The carriage home, a hired one again, her father's familiar December calculation, moved through the April darkness of the coast road, with the particular smell of the season coming through the window gap. Salt, still, but now underlaid with something green and turned and alive. The captain sat across from her with his knee extended, and his expression, in the particular configuration she had learned across 30-odd years, meant he had formed a view and was deciding whether it required speech. It did not, apparently. He looked out at the dark lane, and then at her, and then at the lane again, and then he said, "Good." A single word. But it was the word she had needed, in the specific register only he could offer. The register of a naval man who has survived enough to know what matters, and has stopped wasting effort on precision when a word will do. He came 4 days later. Not to the captain first, that was the convention, and he observed it. But what was different was that he came in the afternoon, when Rosamond was in the parlour, and her father was in the garden, attempting to convince a stubborn section of the vegetable bed to accept a new planting of broad beans. And before he sought the captain, he stood in the parlour doorway and looked at her for a moment, with the direct quality she had by now entirely ceased to find startling. "I want to tell you something before I speak to your father," he said, "so that when you give your answer, it is not contingent on his." She set down the mending. The snuff box was on the mantelpiece behind her, in its place, the morning light off the sea coming in sideways across its worn surface. "I know that you have managed this household without assistance for a long time," he said, "and I know what it has cost, and I am not asking you to exchange a dependence you have outgrown for a different one. I am asking whether you are willing to build something with me that belongs to both of us in the same measure." He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, as he had on the first day, and there was nothing performed about it. "I should tell you that I have been a difficult man to live with since Henry died. I have not been warm to people easily, and I have been watchful in a way that has occasionally substituted for feeling rather than accompanying it. I think you already know this. I am telling you anyway because I believe you deserve to hear it stated rather than discovered. Rosamond looked at him for a moment. "I have been managing my own household since I was 19, she said. "I am not afraid of difficulty." "No," he said. "I know you aren't. And I am not afraid of watchfulness either." She held his gaze. "I watch everything myself." He smiled, briefly, fully, without reservation. A smile she had not yet seen from him at this scale, and which rearranged his face into something that was recognisably, suddenly, also what Henry had looked like at 26, if the laughing face she had been imagining was anything close to accurate. She did not name this. She stored it. "Then I will go and speak to your father about the beans," he said. The captain, it turned out, had been waiting for the conversation with the patience of a man who has been waiting and knows it, and has decided that the dignified position is to let the other party arrive at the moment in his own time. He gave his answer in the vegetable bed, with his hands still carrying the dirt of the morning's work, and the Duke received it the same way. Standing in the April garden, in his good coat, with the equanimity of a man for whom the formal setting of the thing was less important than the fact of it. What the captain felt in that moment, what it cost him, what it gave him, what complex mathematics of a father's grief and a father's relief combined into something he did not name, that was his own private reckoning. He shook the Duke's hand and went inside to wash his hands. And when he came back out, his face had the look of a man who has laid down something heavy and has not yet entirely decided how to stand without it. Mary Pelham came to Eastmoor in the week after Easter, having been placed there through the recommendation of the Eastmoor estate agent, Lowell, who had made it his business to know which families in the parish had daughters of working age. She was 17, the younger sister of the boy who had died of the same fever that had taken 3 children in the parish the previous winter. And she came into service with the combined quality of the recently bereaved and the practically intelligent. Watchful, quiet, present in a room with a completeness that the idle never quite achieve. Mrs. Haddon placed her in the scullery, which was where new girls were placed, and Mary worked the scullery with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the way through a thing is to do it completely and wait for the next thing to present itself. She was small-boned, with dark eyes and hands that were already, at 17, the hands of a working woman, calloused at the palm, quick in their movements, capable of making the efficient look effortless. Rosamond encountered her on a morning in late April, in the east passage near the kitchen garden door, where Mary was carrying a basket of herbs from the kitchen garden to the cook, and managed to drop it on the flags at the moment Rosamond came around the corner. They knelt together to retrieve the scattered sprigs of rosemary and thyme, and in the process of this, Rosamond noticed the girl looking at the small label tied to the basket's handle, a strip of paper on which the cook had written the day's requirement in her large, effortful script, with the particular focused blankness of someone who recognises that the marks have meaning but cannot yet decode them. "Can you read?" Rosamond asked, without making it significant. "No, miss." Mary held the basket steady while Rosamond replaced the herbs. "My brother could. He was learning at the parish school when he—" A brief pause. "I never went. Would you like to?" The girl looked at her with the caution of someone who has learned to assess whether an offer is genuine before accepting it, which was a kind of intelligence that could not be taught, and that Rosamond recognised immediately. "Yes," Mary said, "if it's no trouble." "It's no trouble at all," Rosamond said. She began the following Tuesday with a horn book, borrowed from Mr. Hathaway's collection of parish teaching materials. A worn wooden board with a handle, the alphabet printed on paper beneath a protective layer of translucent horn, its surface rubbed smooth by generations of children's fingers. She and Mary sat at the table in the small room off the Eastmoor kitchen. Not the library. Not yet. Because Mrs. Haddon's tolerance of the arrangement was something to be managed carefully. And installing a scullery maid in the library on a Tuesday morning was a step better taken incrementally, and worked through the letters with the methodical patience of a woman who finds that teaching someone else to see something she already knows is its own particular form of satisfaction. Mary was quick. Not quickly loud about it, quickly quiet. The kind of quickness that works without announcing itself, storing what it learns and applying it without ceremony. By the third session, she could read her own name and the cook's daily list both. And by the fourth, she had moved on to the shorter words in the first page of a primer Rosamond had found in the Eastmoor Library, its spine long since detached from decades of use. Mrs. Haddon observed all of this with the silence of a woman who has decided that her initial assessment may require revision, but is not yet prepared to admit as much aloud. On the morning of the fifth session, she set a small plate of biscuits on the table, near where they were working, without comment, and withdrew. Rosamond noted this with the same care she noted everything. The discovery about Henry's portrait came at the end of May, on an evening when the Duke was going over correspondence at his desk, and she was in the library chair on the other side of the fire, with a volume of natural history that had been the previous Duke's, and which bore, in its margins, a running commentary in a hand she had come to recognise as Henry's from the few notes she had seen elsewhere. A small, precise hand, with the occasional exclamation point rendered in the oversized manner of a young man who is emphatic rather than elegant. She had said nothing of this identification to the Duke, because she had not been certain of it until this evening, and had needed 3 previous encounters with the marginalia to be sure. The note on the page she was reading now was about a passage on coastal migratory birds, and Henry had written, in his small script, that he had personally observed 6 species the author declared rare in the same morning on the Eastmoor Cliffs, and that the author should get out more. She laughed, a small laugh, not loud, and looked up. The Duke looked across from the desk. She turned the book toward him and pointed to the margin. He read it, and something moved across his face. Brief, complex. The particular expression of a man who has been surprised by something that is also a pain and a pleasure simultaneously, in such equal measure that the face cannot quite resolve the two. "That is Henry's," he said. "I thought it might be." He looked at the note a moment longer, then handed the book back. He annotated everything he could get his hands on. My father's charts, the books of sermons in the morning room. Nothing was safe. A brief pause. My mother took the only good portrait when she went to Bath. A pastel that was done when he was 22, 3 years before he died. She could not bear to leave it. He returned his attention to the correspondence. "I have his letters. That is the better record of him, I think." She held the book with the margin note facing her and said nothing further. But she kept the page. The letter to the painter in London, a miniaturist named Cornelius Vane, no relation to Lord Frederick, who had a respectable practice in the Strand and a particular reputation for working from description alone when subjects were not available for sitting, was written 3 days later in the morning room at Wrenwood Cottage, before her father was awake. She had no likeness to send him. What she had was this: the physical description that the Duke had offered in fragments across 5 months of conversation, 26. The laughing face, built more slightly than his brother, with the same dark hair but worn longer, their father's jaw and their mother's eyes. She had Henry's handwriting, which she described as small and precise, with emphatic punctuation. And she had his habit of sitting on floors, and his opinion of the naval author, who should get out more, and the fact of the last letter, full of harvest commentary and a joke about a steward's boots, and the particular quality of ordinary cheerfulness that pervades a letter written by a man who does not know it will be the last one. She told Mr. Vane all of this. She said she wanted not a formal portrait, but a face. The face of a young man who found things worth laughing at, in the last good year before whatever comes next. She enclosed her own banker's draft. The amount, set against everything else she had spent since her mother's garnets went to the jeweller in Lyme, was the last significant drawing she could make from her savings. She sealed the letter and addressed it, and did not permit herself to examine the decision further, because she had already examined it at every angle and arrived at the same conclusion. This was what she had that he could not provide for himself, and it was hers to give. The portrait arrived 6 weeks later, in the last days of June, packed in a flat wooden case with a letter from Mr. Vane expressing his hope that the likeness had been achieved within the limits of the commission, and that the occasion for which it was intended proved, in the event, a memorable one. She opened the case alone, in the morning room, and looked at the face. She had not expected certainty. What she found was something close enough to it. A young man in the small oval of the miniature, painted on ivory, in Mr. Vane's careful style, looking out from the picture with the expression of someone who has just been told something he finds both improbable and genuinely amusing, and has not yet decided which reaction to lead with. The jaw was their father's. The eyes were something she did not have enough information to verify, but which looked as she had imagined them. The hair was dark and worn slightly long. He was 26, and he looked it. Not the 26 of a man who has begun to carry the weight of things, but the 26 of a man who believes the weights are still in the future. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the case. She wrapped it herself, in a piece of the dark wool flannel she had kept, cut from the same bolt as the cloth the Duke had used to wrap the snuff-box when he returned it to her father, and tied it with a length of narrow ribbon, and put it in the drawer of her writing desk, where the brown ledger had lived for 3 years. The ledger was gone now, its accounts settled in the blunt arithmetic of a man who had seen to the specific numbers before any ring was mentioned, and who had done so without referencing the ledger, because he had not needed to. She would give it to him on the morning after the wedding, not before. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and the house was full of the particular productive chaos of an occasion being prepared for by people who take preparations seriously. Mrs. Haddon moving through the rooms of Eastmoor with lists, Polly carrying flowers from the garden to every available surface, the captain at Wrenwood Cottage in his naval coat receiving callers, and performing, with considerable success, the expression of a man who considers the whole enterprise somewhat excessive, while being in fact profoundly moved by it. Tom's letter arrived from Lisbon on the Tuesday before the wedding. It was, as Tom's letters always were, cheerful and thin. A page and a half of news from the Tagus waterfront, 2 paragraphs on the state of the merchant trade, and then, "I hear from Alderton's third cousin, who is in the wine trade, that you are to be a duchess, Ros, which seems to me the most improbable thing I have heard since Harding's scheme with the Calabrian olive oil. And yet, here we are. Give my best to father, and try not to run the Duke's estate more efficiently than he can bear." She read it at the kitchen table and laughed, properly, fully, the kind of laugh that surprises itself, and set the letter on the table, and was quiet for a moment, with the sense of the whole span of it. The January frost, the Admiralty's letter turned to ash, the managed curtains, and the carefully preserved coat, and the brown ledger locked in its drawer. And now this, and Tom in Lisbon writing about Calabrian olive oil, and the wrapped miniature in the writing desk drawer. On the evening before the wedding, she took the case out and held it for a moment. The wool flannel under her hands, the ribbon still tied as she had tied it, the thin weight of the ivory inside. She did not open it again. The morning after the wedding, she would put it in his hands, and she would watch him open it, and she did not know, could not know, with any certainty, how the face inside the oval would meet him after 3 years of letters and 200 readings of the Harvest News and the steward's boots. She knew only that she had made the best likeness she could from everything she had been given, and that she had done it with her own hands, and that the giving of it was the only thing she had that was entirely, irreducibly hers. Whether it would be enough, that was the question the last night before the rest of it carried into morning. Eastmoor in July was a different house from Eastmoor in February. The stone that had held cold through the winter months released something of itself in summer. The corridors were warm now, not merely in the proximity of the fires, but in the particular, thoroughgoing warmth of old walls that have finally been convinced of the season. The parkland beyond the library windows was in full leaf. The oaks at the far edge entirely different creatures from the bare structures she had catalogued in winter, and the ornamental lake caught the morning light and held it in a way that made the whole east prospect look as though someone had decided, overnight, to be generous. Rosamond had been awake since before the household stirred. This, at least, had not changed. She sat at the small writing table near the bedroom window, in the grey of early morning, in the unfamiliar correctness of a room that was no longer a room she visited. The curtains here were good, not the turned and re-hemmed curtains of Wrenwood Cottage, but deep blue damask, a little faded at the right side where the morning light had been working at them for years, which she found she liked. The writing table had been placed there by someone, at some point, who had understood that a person might want to sit and think in the early morning before the day required them. She appreciated this understanding, even retrospectively, from whoever had positioned it. The case was in her hands. She had carried it from the writing desk at Wrenwood Cottage in her travelling bag, wrapped in its wool flannel, the ribbon still as she had tied it. She had set it on the table the night before, not on the mantelpiece, not on the dressing table, but here, where she could see it from the bed and where it would be to hand at exactly this hour, which was the hour she had always known she would give it. She heard him wake. Not from sound exactly, no particular noise announced it, but from the quality of the house, that particular distributed shift in the weight of a building when the person at its centre has come into consciousness. She had noticed this quality of Eastmoor from the first month of her visits and had not been able to name it then. She could name it now. She took the case and went through. He was sitting up, looking at the window, with the morning expression of a man who has learned to take the first minutes of the day carefully, not slowly, not reluctantly, but as one takes the first measure of a thing before committing to a full assessment of it. The July light was coming through the gap in the curtains in a bar of pale gold, and it fell across the far edge of the bed and the floor beyond in a way that made the room look briefly, very simply, like itself. She came to sit on the edge of the bed and held the case out to him. He looked at it, and then at her. "From me," she said. "Not from us. From before." She set it in his hands. "Open it when you're ready." He turned the case in his hands the way he had once turned the snuff box, with the careful attention of a man who understands that some objects require a moment before they require a response. The wool flannel, the ribbon. He undid the ribbon with deliberate fingers and unfolded the cloth, and she watched his face. The case opened. He looked at the miniature for a long time without speaking. The morning light from the window gap fell at the right angle to catch the ivory, not gilded, not theatrical, just clear. And the face in the small oval looked out from it with the expression, "Mr." Vane had rendered from her description. The expression of a man who has just heard something he finds both improbable and genuinely amusing, and hasn't yet decided which reaction to lead with. His jaw changed. A small thing, a tightening, then a deliberate release. Then his eyes. She watched the exact moment the grief arrived. Not as it usually came in the library, controlled and managed to just below the visible threshold, but differently, as it comes when something has outrun the management of it. He wept. Not loudly. The sound was the sound of a man entirely unprepared for the specific form the thing had taken. Not the brother's absence, which he had spent 3 years learning to live with, but the presence. This face, this expression, this particular quality of amused attention that no letter had been able to carry, and which was here now in his hands on a morning in July, looking out at him from a piece of ivory the size of his palm. Rosamond sat beside him and said nothing. She put her hand on his, over the case, and left it there. After a while, the sound stopped. He stayed very still for another minute, looking at the miniature, and then he turned to look at her. His eyes dark, no particular expression that could be named in the usual way. Nothing performed about any of it. "How did you—" "Everything you told me," she said. "And Mr. Vane, who is very good at faces he has never seen." He looked back at the portrait. She watched him take it in the way one takes a thing that must be integrated slowly, a fact that is true but requires several passes before it is fully admitted. His thumb moved, once, lightly, across the edge of the frame, not across the ivory itself. A small, scrupulous gesture, the gesture of a man who wants to touch something and has decided to touch only its border. "I have been trying," he said, "for 3 years to remember him accurately. Not the last weeks, the healthy years, the ordinary Tuesday version of him." A pause. "I was beginning to think I was losing it." "You weren't losing it," she said. "It was in the books." He looked at her. "The natural history commentary," she said. "Page 47. The author should get out more." He laughed. Sudden, surprised. The same quality of laugh she had heard from him when the fire released him in the library in February. But fuller, now. Less guarded at the edges. The laugh of a man who has stopped rationing what he allows himself to find funny. It lasted only a moment, but it was real. "That is Henry, precisely," he said. "I know," she said. Mary brought the breakfast tray at 8:30. She came in with the specific efficiency she had developed over the past 2 months, not the diffidence of the scullery, which she had left behind in April when Mrs. Haddon, without announcement or explanation, had moved her to the position of personal attendant, but the quiet competence of a girl who has discovered that she is capable of more than she was initially asked to demonstrate, and who intends to demonstrate it well. She set the tray on the small table near the window and arranged it, teapot, 2 cups, the bread, the preserves in their small glass pots, with the methodical care of someone who has understood that the arrangement of a tray is also a kind of statement. Then she saw the open case on the bed and the miniature. She had not been told what it was. But her face did what faces do in the presence of something that has altered the room. A brief stillness. A settling. A decision to receive the atmosphere of the moment without requiring it to explain itself. "Thank you, Mary," Rosamond said. "Yes, miss, ma'am." She corrected herself without embarrassment, the correction of a girl who is calibrating a new vocabulary in real time, and finds the challenge interesting rather than frightening. She withdrew. In the passage, through the closed door, Rosamond heard her footsteps, quick and purposeful, already on to the next thing, and thought that in 2 years, possibly less, Mrs. Haddon was going to be presented with a challenge to her authority that would require a negotiation neither party would describe aloud, but both would understand. She poured the tea. The portrait was hung on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into July. She and the Duke had discussed its placement for those 3 weeks with the particular thoroughness that significant things deserve, which meant that each of them had independently arrived at the same answer before either named it aloud. The east corner of the library, the corner nearest the desk, where the afternoon light came in cleanest off the park and fell across the wall in the long, level way of high summer in the south, had a space between two filled shelves where nothing had yet been hung. She had noticed the space in February on her first visit, without knowing then why she was noticing it. The hook was fitted by Lowell, who managed such matters with the quiet competence of a man who understands that the running of an estate includes, occasionally, the driving of a small nail. The frame, gilt, modest, the right scale for the ivory, went up on a Tuesday afternoon while the July light was at exactly the angle required. They stood back. Henry looked out from the corner with the laughing expression that was, Rosamond now understood, entirely characteristic. A face that had spent 26 years finding things worth the response, and the light on the ivory gave him the quality of being present in the room rather than recorded by it. Not a memorial object, a resident one. The Duke stood beside her for a long moment. His hand found hers without looking, the particular gesture of a man who has spent a long time being careful about what he reaches for, and has, recently, stopped needing to be quite so careful. Then he said, "He would have liked you enormously." "I would have liked him," she said. "He would have annotated all your books." "He was welcome to." They stood there a moment longer in the afternoon library, the oaks visible through the long windows in their full July weight. The desk below the portrait, with its worn leather surface and its small drawers. The fire unlit because it was summer and the room was warm on its own account, which still struck her as something to be noted after years of managed coal. The household sounds came through in their ordinary rhythms. Somewhere in the East Passage, Polly's voice. Somewhere below, the kitchen's distant, productive noise. And somewhere nearer, the particular quick footstep in the corridor that was always Mary. Rosamond rested her hand on the desk's edge, beside his, in the afternoon light. The portrait of Henry caught it above them, the laughing face, the amended books, the steward's boots and the harvest, and the letter that had been read 200 times looking for a sign that was never there. All of it now also here, in this room, in this corner, on this Tuesday in July when the light was doing exactly what it ought to.